I see Ashok. Ashok, you have your hand up. You have a question or comment?
I have a question for Winston.
Sure.
You see, Winston, what is this international law that that doesn't allow one country to interfere in the internal affairs of another country? This is causing a lot of problem in India. We see the Sri Lankan Tamils are being ill-treated by the Sinhalese. And politicians in my state are demanding that the central government intervene in a military manner. In Sri Lanka, but the central government is saying we can't interfere in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka, it's a separate country. We can only solve it by diplomatic negotiations. But diplomatic negotiations are not giving any solution for the last 20 years. So frequently, every now and then, strikes and lockout erupt in my state, paralyzing the economy and causing a lot of traffic problem. So I personally feel that this policy of not allowing any one country to interfere in the internal affairs of another country, I don't think this actually promotes peace. It causes a lot of resentment and disharmony actually.
Okay. Well, this principle has a modern history. And that modern history emerges from the following facts of international life. At the end of the Second World War, huge chunks of the planet were still under colonial rule. And as the countries became decolonized, they found that their sovereignty was very porous and frequently still controlled by the colonial masters. And so one of the things that these weak new sovereigns demanded was that they should have autonomy over their internal affairs. Now, this principle of autonomy over their internal affairs is also the sovereignty principle codified in Article 2.7 of the UN Charter, namely that the UN or anyone else or any other individual state cannot interfere in matters within the domestic jurisdiction of the state. Okay, so the particular article in the Charter never uses the word sovereignty, but what they use is a weaker form of sovereignty, namely domestic jurisdiction. The entire international law of the UN Charter, as it evolved in the last century into this one, has been an effort to understand where the lines are between domestic jurisdiction that's exclusive to the state and the matter of international concern, which permits intervention, you see. And we live in a decentralized world, so if the problem in Sri Lanka is of such a magnitude as it might threaten international peace and security, theoretically the matter should be taken up by the Security Council, okay? And the Security Council then say, well, this is a problem that threatens international peace and security, and then it has a toolkit of things it can use against the state that's not upholding its obligations. Now, this is a very controversial issue because you could say, well, Syria is a classical example of this. But the Security Council has been stopped in its tracks by China and Russia. Okay? They vetoed any action. And that represents a problem for the UN system because now, even if you've made the decision that there is a threat to international peace and security, it's been blocked by the Security Council, and either you have to find a better way to handle it within the UN Charter system, or we just have to sit around and watch people being butchered and murdered. And that's certainly a problem. That's one of the constitutional problems that needs some remedial action. I think some reform. There could be several ways of doing that. You could, for example, say that in the future, if a member, the permanent member on the Security Council veto, it must carry 2 other permanent members with it, so that they need at least 1 before they can veto. So that would probably provide more flexibility in the current system. It depends on what you think about a Security Council, 5 permanent members, each having a veto to block any action. So I know where you're coming from on this, but the Sri Lankan problem is a reflection of problems in other parts of the world as well. I may remind you that it was India that brought the issue of apartheid to the United Nations successfully because of the treatment by the nationalist government of Indians of Indian origin in South Africa. That's how it first got on the agenda. And South Africa said, oh no, our treatment of the Indians in South Africa is a matter of pure domestic jurisdiction, not a matter of international concern. Indians have no interest in this whatsoever, and neither does the UN. But that failed.
Thanks, Winston.
I think obviously this is another argument for the need for a higher, the imperfect nature of what we have now.
That's correct.
On one issue, India doesn't want the UN to intervene in Kashmir. In another, people in India want to intervene in Sri Lanka.
Right.
So that's a justification for the need for, we have not yet evolved a global system that can really handle all our issues effectively. Anyone else have a question for Winston?
Let me just add one. This idea of non-interference in internal affairs is very largely a third world idea. It was weak sovereigns trying to protect themselves against their former colonial masters.
Yeah, former colonies, especially.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Don't see any hands so far. Winston, I think you've made a case for strengthening a global constitutive process. I mean, the whole purpose that we're going to Geneva for is to say that we need a new paradigm in order to address global challenges effectively. And you have suggested that the global nature of the challenges we're facing requires a global constitutive process. So I have 2 questions. One is, to what extent does that process already exist? And the second...
It does exist. It does exist. Chirac, the French president, said the UN Charter is our global constitution. And many other leaders have said that. But then there's the rhetoric and there's no action, you know?
So are there areas that we can point to? My 2 questions are, one, are there areas we can point to that de facto we have already accepted the validity of this need? And secondly, what would we do, what should we do in order to strengthen it? If our goal is to address global crises, what is the fundamental change that we need to make?
Well, I think there's several, but one clearly the issue of peace and security is an area that needs to be strengthened, and we can see the impotence of the UN in the context of Syria right now, which is a major problem, and the impotence of the UN in the Palestinian Israeli problem and the effort to develop a settlement in that regard. Again, of course, the Israelis view the UN as an enemy because they don't believe in the values that the UN stands for. But I think we should have an open discussion of those issues. So global security and whether we need some, I think, I'm not sure what exactly is on the table at the UN now, but my own view is that I would prefer to see the number of permanent members of the Council expanded. I think Brazil, Germany, India should be members, possibly even South Africa to have an African state on as well, and that the veto to block any UN action requires 3 permanent members of this expanded body in order to block any action. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to rethink the authority foundations of the Security Council. Does it still reflect the notion that the dominating powers with the biggest stick will carry the biggest weight and can dominate the weakest? That is an important value question that I won't, but we might want to think about that. Second, there has been, at least in my view, a shift from the UN to something called now, I think, the G20, where the major economic decisions and understandings that are generated from the G20. In short, what has happened is the major economic powers have taken consideration and decision from the UN and put it into some informal body whose rules and organization and competence to shape the futures of the rest of the planet are not altogether clear, you know. So I can't see the G20 as representing, if you like, global democracy in action, global good governance, global accountability, global responsibility. I think we have some major issues there as well. And that issue of the G20 will touch on other things like food, climate change, and so on. So it seems to me that we are confronted with a crossroads where clearly the UN needs more empowerment, but the UN also needs to be able to emerge with a justification for greater empowerment than it currently has. See, one of the things that I think affects us is that when you use law, you really are talking about law as an institution for vindicating values. Okay? So, for example, Martin suggested last night that one of the most important contributions that aesthetics can make to the human future is that it provides a sense of desire, a sense of happiness. I mean, a future with music, with art, with poetry, with drama, and so on. Has to be a part of whatever future we envision for mankind. So you can't take aesthetics out of it. You know? But now, we don't quite know how we're actually going to do this. How are we going to empower aesthetics? Would human rights be the best vehicle to do so or not? And when he talks about deepening our understanding of the way corporations function, the way financial institutions function, the way climate change happens, and so on, he recognizes that we need some type of governance outside of nation states. but he never mentions the UN Charter, which I think has a lot of promise, but doesn't complete the picture. And he doesn't say, well, let's mobilize our intellectual capacities to figure out how we can expand the notion of authoritative and controlling decision-making on a global level consistent with the rule of law and consistent with the global constitution. Hello?
Winston, if we could go back to one of the starting premises for this discussion, and that was we were questioning whether national sovereignty is an adequate term in the modern day, and if it isn't, then as you were suggesting, I think we have certainly done in our paper, that there is a legitimate role for humanity as a whole in this process. How do we, how do we go about effecting that? What are the options for enabling humanity to express, exercise a role in global governance?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of work still needs to be done here, and it requires a certain form of strategic thinking. Who are the basic institutions outside of governance that can be mobilized in this regard? For example, academic institutions of higher learning and science could be mobilized in this direction, although many are co-opted by the nation states and find that the sovereigns feed them and therefore they service the sovereigns. But in addition to that, where we see the most activist forms of civil society functioning, I think are in areas like the human rights movement, where you have the great NGOs of the world, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, League for, and so on. So there is a whole constituency there, and in fact, I would suggest that the reason human rights has remained on the forefront of global consciousness is because of the activity and activism of these INGOs, and there are a number of them. And one of the most important of these INGOs is the Red Cross. No one ignores the Red Cross, at least in terms of conflict and so on. So we do have, what we don't have is an inventory of all of it, you know. We don't have an inventory of the academic side, the scientific side, the public interest side, the humanitarian side, the human rights side, the humanitarian side, the humanistic side, and so on. A great deal is institutionalized, but we haven't, as I said, we probably need a team and some very, very good computer people to get an inventory of all of these resources. And then the question is, how can they be mobilized to common purposes at the global level? That's one. Two, I should also mention the World Social Forum, which touches on sovereign debt and environmental issues and so on. One of the important questions in the UN process is, it is an institution by and for states, so that the INGOs come in through the back door, and while they've made some noise and motion, their potentials remain underdeveloped, I think. And then the question is, can the UN open up its doors? Can it open up its doors to representatives from the sciences, from the academies and so on? Can the something like the World Academy or Club of Rome or whatever, can they have members that can attend selected meetings of the UN on a regular basis, keep up with the agenda of what's happening and so on? Because a lot of the action will take place when assuming the UN has a treaty, to implement the treaty and to examine it over time, it will create basically a conference of the states parties. So then a selected number of sovereigns with an interest in it meet periodically, and they hone out the thing. I've attended some of these representing the Shuar from the Amazon. And, you know, the limited number of civil society participation just means that some of these meetings are quite awful. What was originally decided gets watered down, twisted, turned, or driven into impotence. I'm not saying it happens in all cases, but it does happen significantly. So what we need, I think, is a way in which the UN can begin to do more of civil society. There should be some kind of a permanent representative at the Security Council and at the General Assembly and at other UN forums on women's issues globally and the status of women. Then there is the International Association of Civil Society. That's all computerized. So there's another group. If we can get an inventory of the great and relatively organized civil society across the planet, it's a massive undertaking, and we probably need to put in a grant to some major foundation to have such a study going. So if we can have this kind of inventory and get a sense of where the groups can be coordinated, you know, into a voice of global civil society. This is a vision that is shared by several WAAS members. You know, Dick Falk and Burns Weston and several others have said that's where the next wave of, that's the substitute for the Westphalian state, you see, globally speaking. But it takes resources and it takes graduate students to be working. I mean, we really have to make a commitment to do this. And then the final part of your picture would be, even if we got this, how do we inventory what they want? How do we know what global civil society wants? And there are some extremely innovative strategies and methods that have been used to actually distill operant subjectivity. And somebody that I would like to propose for, as a fellow is an expert on this particular methodology, which is not as well known, but highly respected. And it's the idea, basically, of getting outside of the sovereign state to figure out what people want. You know? And the first most important thing about politics is, if you don't claim something, you're not going to get it. You know, if you want peace, you've got to claim it. If you want human rights, you've got to claim it, you see. And that's one of the things that we could probably be instrumental in moving forward.
Incidentally, Winston, you know, this concept of civil society organizations is a concept that was there in ancient Indian democracy. The original concept of democracy, which goes back a couple thousand years in India, there was a monarch, but the monarch had absolutely consent, and there were representing the main constituent parties of the society, the agricultural community, the merchants, and I don't know what others as well. So the idea of an intermediate group, you know, between the individual, there are precedents for it. Of course, that would raise the issue of how representative are the civil society organizations. And one thing that might be done is to, you know, to evaluate the legitimacy or voice to be given to a civil society organization by the extent to which it's representative and itself democratically functioning, which we know is usually not the case, even for the civil society organization.
Yeah, we often don't know who funds them, you know.
Well, we've even seen in our own organization that in the name of democracy, a civil society organization can be as authoritarian as as anybody else. My other question would be about, I mean, in the field of international humanitarian law, as I understand it, this is an area where the sovereignty of the nation state is subject to some serious constraints and limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a way, there is a recognition that human beings have rights that may not be enforced by sovereign states, and that there must be mechanisms in which to enforce those rights. And is there a way to increase and strengthen those mechanisms to significantly alter the present equation of global governance? Unfortunately, in that area, though I asked the question, the humanitarian rights are not really being, they're being defended by somebody, but humanity itself is not really represented in that defense, is it?
Well, now, the leading INGO in the world in the defense of humanitarian law and humanitarian values is the Red Cross. Mm-hmm. The Red Cross is not a governmental organization. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I would say that if you look at I don't know about the democracy and all that sort of stuff, but the Red Cross has a very credible reputation. Mm-hmm. It is an important part of a global civil society. And we often think of human rights and humanitarian law as bringing in the Red Cross, Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Helsinki Watch, and so on. I think in the area of humanitarianism and human rights, there is a significant and well-established global civil society that's well-organized, credible, and so on. I mean, they could be strengthened, and their role in international. My sense is that they're not really theoretical organizations, okay? So they never quite grapple with unpacking sovereignty, you know, or the global constitution or whatever. So there's a big role for an organization like us, and then the question of democratizing global economic order and unpacking the deep. So there's still a big scope for what I think we can do in terms of the leadership. Yeah. That's for sure. Mm-hmm. But you know, I have to tell you, there are about 10 or 12 different meanings to the word sovereignty, first of all. And the legal one is merely one that hides in the shadows, but defines things. And so, in a sense, some of my academic work has been to unpack sovereignty, to take the mystery out of it, and to make it amenable and comprehensible to non-lawyers. You don't just incant the word sovereignty and everyone shuts up, you know, which often happens at the UN. If a sovereign state talking, everyone shuts up, you know. Could be some banana republic, Lord knows who. So that is one of the things that if any of the participants want to get a copy of that recent piece that I did on the evolution of sovereignty, I can send it to them. And the last 3 pages summarize the constitutional process.
Mm-hmm. How do we go further? You say there's a role for WAAS. Now, at the Geneva Conference, our goal is not, I think, to be incrementally reasonable. I think our goal is to make a case that there are solutions. And however far we have to move the goalposts in order to get those solutions, I mean, we're probably going to be talking some pretty radical things in different parts of this conference. If we want to address the issue of employment, it's not going to come through more initiatives of the central banks. It's not going to be done without a radical control over the international financial markets way beyond what we have today. I think our point,
I think we should say is that the G20 should regularize itself within the framework of the UN system, okay, with a set of rules, minutes, recorded decisions, and an ability to appraise those decisions against the fundamental value of the UN Charter.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the G20 as an incremental step.
Yeah.
Does it fundamentally address as a more representative organization than the Security Council? That's your point, right?
This is a kind of economic security council, is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have rules to invokes it and who presides and what, you know, what's the scope of its authority, etc., etc. You see.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think the last time the G20 was meeting, the UN was also having a meeting on the same thing, but none of the G20 people came to the UN meeting, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anne, would you like to raise any point, any question, or any issue? Neela, anything on your mind like to raise? I know there are things on your mind. I mean,
always. Some of the things that are already happening is that we have a tremendous disjunction. So something that I talked to Winston about what is already happening in the streets and what is being represented as happening, or what is being muted, you know, and watered down by the time it gets to be heard at some of these places, such as the summit in Rio or at the United Nations. And that's one of the things that Winston was saying, you know, some of this also gets decided under the pressure of certain groups, and then it gets eventually watered down. Even the decisions themselves are not becoming effective. One of the things that is happening beyond being physically present in the streets through Occupy and with all of its own challenges and things is there's a huge general sweeping movement of sort of calling people on their reputation. And some of them are local in nature that are involving mostly social networks that are organized projects. Even in my own hometown, tiny little 25,000 people place in Montenegro, the local government is being terribly bashed in a very intelligent, truly organized and intelligent way on the social networks over their decisions. In this particular case is involving situation with trash and things like that. So there's a way to sort of link in very personal ways, I think, people from big shots. I know they're easily reachable, but from G20, for example, what Winston is talking about this transparency, the big word, that needs to be called upon through personal reputation and the way these people can be reached in very personal terms. One of the things that I mentioned in the last paper that I presented was how can we reach all these different groups of people like tech wizards and retired disillusioned military and spiritual leaders and corporate philanthropists, all these potential misfits within their own domain. How can we get them all at the same table? And I think that's one of the challenges. one of the things that Winston keeps mentioning, and that him and I have been thinking about together, is the aesthetic rights, which most of the time what we see is that they get sort of covered with a small blanket term of cultural rights, the right to enjoy and participate in culture, which can easily also be tied to the nation or ethnic group or tradition, the same way sovereignty is tied to the nation state that way. And our call for a more democratic access to aesthetic rights that we talked about. And then again, we see a disjunction of what is happening in the streets in the powerful way. The art has been, collective art and individual art has been used in all different art media, has been used for debunking authority, for challenging authority, and as well as for envisioning other modes of being in the world. So there's disjunction, what is already happening, as if the future is already happening between that and the regulatory system and the representation in the institutions, or the access to the institutions. So I see it in different ways, and I also, when we talked about the aesthetic rights, I thought that they're actually cutting into everything, into education, into human rights. Winston and I try to make a case that as we studied history, realized that aesthetics were actually the foundation of, at the very inception of human rights. So they cannot be dispensed of. In that sense, we are sort of calling for reinstitution of them within the UN Charter, especially if we take into account that certain groups, populations, have no other existence but as within aesthetic states of their own traditions. And I mentioned in my paper, for example, the Gypsies or the Roma or the Native Americans, in the terrible, terrible paradox of, you know, them being used as an emblem somehow of the U.S. cultural identity, while at the same time the U.S. still is refusing to sign up the rights of the indigenous people. So for some of these people, access to any kind of representation, any kind of power, any kind of visibility to begin with, is through the aesthetic rights that cannot be dismissed anymore in terms of colorful multiculturalism and that kind of cultural benevolence, you know, parading around at festivals and fairs, but that rather what is happening in the streets needs to be fortified and acknowledged and made visible, so as to say that this is our reality. This is in action. This is happening already in action. So I guess that's what I'm thinking about on my feet as I'm thinking with you. I'm thinking that there's something happening already that it needs to be brought to the table in terms of, are you aware? Do you know? Have you divorced yourself from it altogether? And what is our investment into muting these kind of voices, and as well as trying to acknowledge them and make their way into charter? I mean, acknowledging aesthetic rights on the basis of what Winston and I proposed would be a dramatic and significant move. And I think it, as somebody may try to debunk it as, like I said, colorful representation of multiculturalism, it really isn't that. It's very individualized, highly subjective, highly democratic, and much, much more open than we have seen before. And actually may be slightly dismissed exactly on the basis of people who understand how it's serious consequences, that you're opening it to so much more than just so to speak, aesthetic representation. So that's it, I guess.
Winston, did you want to add anything on this topic before Anne has another contribution? But if you want to follow.
No, I think one of the giant steps forward that the UN can take is a much clearer embrace of global aesthetics. It's a fundamental. I think that's a really important issue.
Can you elaborate a little more on what that would mean?
Well, we're working on it. But fundamentally, I take Martin, what's his name, the guy from England, he had suggested that as we look to the future, post-climate change, post-corporate domination, etc., etc., humanity is going to need a renaissance in the arts, a renaissance in the essential qualities of humanism, and that renaissance is going to have to come through aesthetics, essentially. And that's because what humanity will look forward to is that which is pleasing and that which essentially makes people happy. So you can't say we want a future, but it's going to be so dour and dull and bereft of any aesthetic that, you know, I just can't see how that's going to move forward anyway. So that gives this idea an extremely important, I think, dimension. Now, Mila and I have to work this through. She is ahead of me. I haven't been able to get back to her latest version because I've had some personal problems to deal with. But I plan to do it in the next week or two and get back with her on that. So hopefully when we get to Geneva, I think she and I will probably have worked out a little position.
Thank you.
Well, I can since Gary said that we're here. I mean, there is a position, and a very specific one, that the human rights need to be treated and accounted for as inherent, inalienable, and invaluable human rights. And sort of ratified with a concatenated proposition of the indivisibility of all essential human rights. That is, in a sort of a chain embedded connection within human rights, they should not be something we should be fighting for. In essence, within the notion of human dignity, they are, and we prove our case in the paper, that they are fundamentally human, that they define humanity, and as such should be the basis of inalienable rights. So one of the things that we say here that we need to ask the aesthetic rights entitle all humans to artistic creation, self-determined aesthetic representation, aesthetic education, appreciation, distribution, contribution, and reward. Aesthetic rights require that all humans be given the basic material and educational resources for artistic self-expression, as well as means of exhibition and dissemination of their artistic creation. Furthermore, aesthetic rights include not only human participants, but also artworks themselves. Aesthetic rights demand equal treatment of all art creations and art forms, as well as equal representation of all critical diversity of aesthetic conceptions. So this is a very comprehensive request, and it comes at sort of at the very end as a summary of the things, of the different parts of what we've done, which is explaining the situation regarding the philosophical base in the German Enlightenment era, and the role aesthetics played, the foundational role they played within the notion of cosmopolitanism, as well as the rise and inception of human rights. Then we go on to discuss particularly the fundamental value of art and aesthetics for the self-definition and the self-determination and evolution of humanity in all of those aspects, as well as that we identify a list of social functions and roles of art. Some of them I can mention, I'll just not define them, but I'll just mention them. The social functions and roles of art is one is imaginative, contemplative, educational, consultative, socially reformative or transformative, historical, empathic, therapeutic, and play, as well as transcendental. So there's a whole list of roles it plays that are then in detail justified and explained, right along with this notion of what I said, that human rights in the United Nations, I mean, just like Winston pointed out, United Nations are reserving seats only for nation states. That same way human rights seem to be including and covering and are capable of protecting only citizens. I mean, one thing is, like you said, how they're constituted, and the more ideal version is to how they're being actually effectively used. So that we need to, there's actually a way through which aesthetic rights would be furthermore expanding human rights from within.
Mm-hmm.
Actually increasing the capacity and the reach of human rights from within, which is an interesting sort of a compensation from human rights to its foundational aspect of aesthetics. So that is just and I'll read just one more passage just to clarify this, because we talk about what we need to be very specific. So what we're experiencing today is a greater democratization of genius and recognition of the artistic capacity in a wider number of individuals, bringing in the perspective on the ordinary and the taken for granted as exquisite and artistically endowed. As a universal, inalienable, and inherent human right, the aesthetic needs to encompass complexity of human life forms that exceed simplistic equating and leveling of their diversity and nuances. Aesthetic rights would include a whole spectrum of existing aesthetics and visions of the new. In the process of considering these, the very human nature gets redefined. Ratification of aesthetic rights would do justice to the variety of human conditions and the aesthetics derived from those, as well as facilitate continual redefinition, democratization, and redistribution of the aesthetic itself. So I guess what another thing that we should be looking at is that the aesthetic tends to be subsumed or overtaken by the notion of the ethical, and that's the relationship between aesthetics and human rights that should need to be taken into account, as if aesthetics are divorced from the consideration of what is morally good. So instead of having aesthetics reduced to and subsumed by its ethical function, to have it institutionally situated within human rights is in fact to free it from such one-dimensional and subservient role, and rather place it at the core of human existence as a form of knowing and being in the world. Human dignity and the dignity of human rights lie exactly in availing of the need to prove their validity, and rather in spending energy on and engaging resources in creating conditions for their actualization. So I think that's plenty, plenty from us to say. That's a lot.
Thank you. And let's hear from you.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm more or less just a listener in this debate. There are so many things that you all said. I want to congratulate you on your work. I'm not enough in the field to I have some ideas, but I would like to put them on the paper and maybe send them to you. Anyway, I think that you're really doing a great job. It's just one thing though. What would be the most comprehensive way to pass these ideas to the people who we are targeting here? Because obviously there is UN and there is all these organizations that are already established, that we are addressing basically the whole world. So is there a path to these people so that they can see what we are discussing here, aside from the UN? That's just a question, and I'm sorry for being so basic compared to you with all your specific proposals and ideas.
Very good question. Winston, would you like to respond?
I'm not sure that I followed him fully on that. Could you just repeat the last part of it?
Sorry?
Could you just the last part of your question, the comment?
So what ways could we? So there will be after the Geneva and all these. What kind of document will we offer, and who will be the people that we are addressing, apart from the UN? Because obviously we're talking to the whole world. So can we make something like a one-pager or something like that that would be available to different groups? Who are the stakeholders besides the UN?
We haven't made a decision on how that will be, but I think you're probably right. We need a short executive summary of the high points. And then we also need a more considered document that supports the high points, So probably we'll have to come up with two. But you're quite right. We need an executive summary that's relatively short, to the point, and will capture the imagination of the reader, who want to then follow up on that in a more considered document. So, but we haven't made any specific decision on that yet. And I thought you were driving at the, I myself had not thought through whether we should suggest changes that are more quantum in their reach, or whether we should be politically conservative and scratch the fringes of the UN system, make a change here, push this, push that. Now, Gary says he thinks this is an opportunity to put the best and most important futuristic ideas on the table. I think I agree with that myself.
Okay.
One of the things we have discussed as a possible final outcome of this project, not the UN, not the Geneva Conference itself, but of the whole process we're going through. One of our premises is that as of today, there is no coherent vision of an overall solution to the problems confronting humanity. We've got 50% youth unemployment in some countries and 30% in others, and it's clearly not a stable future. The proliferation of weapons, we've still got a lot of people starving, and education is, we're talking here about aesthetic rights, but we've still got a large percentage of humanity that doesn't have basic, real access to basic education yet. We've got the threat of catastrophic climate change, if not catastrophic nuclear problems. We know that developing countries, emerging countries are not going to modify their needs and aspirations to because of the environmental constraints. As of today, we have international financial markets, which we have one more member of this seminar, I think.
Yeah, it's my dog.
We have no assurance that the financial crisis that occurred in 2008 will not return. In fact, it's not even been finished yet, because the accumulation of money at the international level, which is beyond the reach of sovereign governments, is growing daily. It's in the last 4 years, it's grown by another 10 or 15, 20 trillion dollars. So I think our point is that we would like to project a coherent message that shows that these challenges can be met, but they probably cannot be met through incremental changes that are going to be politically correct and within the present range of acceptability even to most sovereign governments. But I think our target today is not to be politically correct. Our target today is to project before the humanity that there are ideas that can solve our problems. We're looking at leadership in thought that can show people that there are solutions. These are not insoluble problems. the climate problem, the economic problem, the financial problem, the problem of food, the problem of security. But it requires a willingness to move on, to evolve as a global society. And so my concern would not be so much with how are we going to implement this the day after tomorrow. Can we put forth a coherent view that can withstand, serious scrutiny? And then it's a challenge. It represents a challenge to conventional wisdom to either find a better way to solve the problems within their framework, or to be willing to move that framework farther, which is essentially what Club of Rome did 30 years ago, or now 40 years ago, with respect to the environmental issue, except that they didn't really have an answer. They only had a problem they were projecting. They were saying you cannot continue the way you are, but they didn't really have a solution. I think what we're trying to do is say there is a solution, and it's a many-faceted, a multi-dimensional solution that's going to have to involve all aspects of global society, of which global rule of law and governance and institutions of governance are critically important. So, how we communicate that, of course, is an important issue, and I think we have to first formulate that, and we're in the process of a process, though we've been invited to the UN, we kind of still think of this as an internal process, not internal to the academy, but internal to a group that are willing to share their thoughts and contribute to formulating solutions, even if they lie outside the traditional boundaries. Maybe our product will be a report, a book, I don't know, that has a very strong, compelling message. And it's a challenging message.
Marketing, if you want, right? I mean, it's because that's something. When you mentioned the Club of Rome and their report, it was at the end a book, and it was maybe that is something I'm thinking, right now. But maybe that could be something in the end of this process that we are doing. Something public in a way, something where we address everybody and say, hey, here is the problem, but here are some of the possible solutions also, something like that. In the end, I know that this conference now in Geneva is not going to bring that, but to have somewhere along the line, that point, that we're going there and we produce something in the end we can offer. That's basically my thinking, or my
Geneva is just a step along the way. Right after Geneva, we have 2 more days in Alexandria for a more detailed discussion, and then we'll continue after that. We'll decide how to take it forward, but we're pretty sure that we're not at the end of the process next month. Mm-hmm. Mila, is that the hand up?
Yeah, I had a couple of points. One of them is my fear was exactly, and when I talked to Winston when we talked about aesthetic rights, that one of the first lines of dismissal will be, well, there's food, there's problem of hunger, poverty, war out there, and how do we defend our position in respect to that? And one of the things when you're saying there's the basic literacy issues versus, what we're asking for. So I just want to make sure that this kind of call is covered in our argument in a way that actually establishes that to have aesthetic rights is the foundation of good education. That covers the question of what kind of education, as you introduce literacy, as you teach letters, what kind of reading skills are you introducing, rather than, following and creating another brick in the wall, as Pink Floyd would effectively say. But another point I wanted to make, I've been thinking about what this amazing idea, first of all, this amazing opportunity to have WAAS represented in the UN and be active in the discussions, and what Winston was saying about how can we sort of wedge in our way into the UN and have representations of, say, WAAS, of Club of Rome, or other, powerful NGOs. Is there a way to gain leverage and create an argument, persuade the UN that obviously we are realizing today through what Winston was saying, that the UN is the already global regulatory system, sort of a process in place, and that we should rely on it, the structure, the scaffolding is there, and that we need to strengthen it rather than, reinvent the wheel. So is there a way to create some kind of leverage in an argument in which we would say that adding these kinds of organizations strengthens the legitimacy, the efficacy, the efficiency of the UN in the eyes of the nation states, rather opening the UN from within that way, rather than having to defend ourselves and act like, small groups that are showing there and being for space to voice themselves, but rather to sort of offer an argument to say to open up UN that way would also open up and show the nation states the power of the voice of the public, of the civil society, the multifaceted nature of the civil society, and the power that is already in place by sort of unifyingly bringing that in, because we talked before about the issues within NGOs that they're not able to create. They are being now more so to create joint fronts, because they're being for financial support, they're being for visibility and credibility. And if we take that, at least partially alleviate some of that, to present them sort of as at the UN as a reinforcing power for the UN efficiency, rather than sort of begging and pleading for some space in there. Is there a way to create some kind of leverage, some kind of argument that this would actually bring sovereignty to the UN and the authority from the people that Winston was talking about?
Good question.
Well, the text helps. The text of the UN Charter helps. The very first line says, "We the people." Yeah, not we the states, we the people, and that was not an accident. The Charter itself is a document that has ambiguity in it, because you read the first preamble and the first article, it's really about individuals and people, But when you come to the third one, it's, well, the membership, well, that's the states only. So there, the drafters didn't reconcile the problem of the people and the problem of the states. So when we got to the 1990s and the UN was doing some rather inept things in Southeastern Europe, the UN's position was, we are just taking orders from a directorate of states. Okay? We don't really have, they are telling us what to do, a directorate of states. So that was, I think, in my view, one of the worst admissions of the UN position. And it affected the way the UN functioned and the efficacy and authority of its functions. But I think we can get back to the we the people idea. I mean, human rights make the individual the subject, not the object of human rights. So you can't just say, oh, international society, the subjects are only the sovereign states. Yeah? So the text certainly gives you an important opening to do this. Now, the problem, of course, is that states are more organized than people's organizations and more focused. And so when they were in China, the Chinese made it clear, we didn't want all these civil society people floating around the UN. Let's put them 16 miles away from the site. So we don't have to see them, you see. So these battles go on. I was a delegate of Amnesty.
But that testifies to their power.
Yeah, right.
They're afraid of them. As long as there is something like that, there can be some leverage next to the public, whatever the public is constituted of.
Now, one of the units of the UN that is always under fire is the Human Rights Council. And in the meetings, well, of course, the states are there. They get themselves voted on the council and so on. Usually, the worst offenders are the ones that fight to get on the council so they can limit the damage for themselves, you see. So now, but it was one of those fora that very early on, they allowed human rights NGOs to be participating, you see. We didn't have the vote, but we could get up there and accuse Syria or accuse this one or accuse that one, and they were petrified. What are you guys going to say about us tomorrow? But that is the agency that has received so much underground flack from sovereign states. Yeah? If you guys are really listening to civil society, we're going to go after you. We're going to go after the head of the thing. We're going to, that kind of stuff. See? So it is an extremely political process. That's the point. And the more you cut civil society in, the more uptight sovereigns get. That's the problem with it. So I don't want to underestimate the problem of integrating global civil society. It may be the case that, you look at Amnesty, it's an ordinary people organization. So a lot of the unwashed of the planet are members, you see. But maybe the World Academy and the Club of Rome are not quite so unwashed. So we may be able to open that gap a little bit more and provide space for the others to follow, you see.
I think if we're looking in terms of winning something or winning over, I don't think that's going to happen. Like we said, we need to look at it as a process, and that to have enough dialogue, to have enough even dialogue under tension is better than throwing up, with defeatism, hands up in the air and saying, oh, well, we already know we cannot reach them. They're obviously anxious. People are anxious. As much as we complained about the moral vacuity of today, there is still some of these, like we talked at 2 Montenegrin conferences, there is some things, the traditional values that still get to us and get to some people in power as well, as you say, as uptight they can get. The notion of reputation and respectability, even as twisted it might be, is something that still can be used. The people still can be called on it, and they are anxious about it. As big as China is, as much as we can say, even in people power and institutional power, what can we do there? They're anxious about the civil groups and being called on what is being done. So I think what we're looking at is a process and dialogue and a little bit of push and pull, and like you said, bringing in some unruly members of world affairs and things like that. It's possible.
I don't think we carry a tarnish of a particular ideological agenda. Plus, at this point, we're so far post-Cold War that we're not going to carry some of that baggage, And so, if anything, I would suspect that because of our position on nuclear weapons and that sort of stuff, that the U.S. may be the one that's most opposed to us. Because the Russians they are much more, if you like, progressive on trying to get rid of nukes than we are. So I think that this may be a good time to come in as a genuine intellectual force with some scientific know-how, some humanistic understanding to see what we can do. And we have to make sure that no one looks at what we've got as oh, this is an agenda of the French or the British or the Americans or the Russians or the Chinese. It's not anyone's particular agenda. It's certainly no nation state's agenda. No?
Neela, going back to your aesthetic rights for a minute, I did raise that question of marketability, I guess. I'm not worried about that, but I think that there may be, I don't know whether it will undermine your objective, but it seemed to me that we could make a strong argument that the solution to the problems we have today are it's not only a question that individual nation states cannot handle these problems. Nation states, even together, even working together, government itself doesn't have the capacity to solve all these problems. These are problems that have to be solved by people. And therefore, it's not just a question that, of arguing for strengthening the institutions of global governance. The parallel I have is that when I've studied a lot the Indian freedom movement, and the Indian freedom movement could be organized by a group of very dedicated, idealistic workers who organized a party and worked for 30, 40 years to drive the British out of India. But the moment they had done that, they found that they were dealing with a totally different problem. Because when you've got an enemy and you're trying to get rid of them, you can all work together to get rid of them. But when you want to create a prosperous country, you've got to make everybody work. You've got to make everybody more productive. It's not something that can be done by a government. The governments don't develop nations. Certainly, government didn't make the United States prosperous. And all of the decades of India's efforts, whatever prosperity has come, it's not come, we can give them some credit, but it's not come because of a government program. It's become because the people develop. So going back to this idea of aesthetic rights, I'm going back to the theme of Montenegro on individuality. I think we could make a very strong argument, and I'll give you one example of how I think it could be done, that if we're going to solve our problems, it's not enough that national governments are strong. It's not enough that global institutions for nation states to interact are strong. We have to enrich the fundamental human capital that constitutes humanity. And that means not just give them a set of fixed skills, not just train everybody to be an engineer, to be a software engineer or a doctor or something, because we have to, it's not that there are that many jobs to be filled. We're going to have to create jobs. People are going to have to be creative and individual enough to create new forms of work, new ways to contribute. So personally, I like the word creativity, innovation, which certainly means freedom for aesthetic expression and development of that. It is really what we're going to need: more individuality. We're going to need more innovation. We're going to need more creativity. And we cannot run this by rules and very narrow conceptions of the state is not going to create that creativity. The state can only provide the freedom and the encouragement. And maybe I wasn't thinking this until I listened to you, but it seemed to be outside the purview of Geneva, but it seems to me we could make a strong case that the future paradigm we're talking, and this Ivo will love this because that's been his theme all along. The future paradigm is not a mechanism of global governance. new paradigm in which we've got to equip the human race, the people, with greater capacities and give them greater freedom. So it's a human capital-driven strategy. And in order to do that, you cannot liberate human potential without giving humanity expression, without giving people not just freedom, but giving them a voice. It's not enough you say you can do anything you want. Somebody's got to listen to us. So unless we're going to find a way to create organs for the individual and civil society to actively express themselves, we're not going to release the energy and creativity that the society needs. Governments are not creative. They're bureaucratic, mechanistic, repetitive. They're clinging to trying to safeguard their existing. Every government has the first priority is how do we get reelected? How do we stay where we are, not how do we move the world along? So maybe there is a way, I'm just talking out loud, but maybe there is a way to weave this in a way that would be, that could directly fit into the overall message that we're trying to project.
And one of the things, I mean, I'll go back and repeat the sort of the anecdotal saying that I said in the previous seminar. We used to say that, the people needed U.S. World War II, World War I. Now we're saying the U.S. needs people, literally, to be saved. That same way we can gain some leverage in our arguments when we talk about the UN needing people to fortify its global reach and establish its efficiency and authority, the way Winston talked about, that the greater number of organizations of that kind are mobilized, that it strengthens the UN in ways that I think even the members, because see, they have to, on the human level, on the gut level, the people that are at the UN as representative of their state, I can guarantee you that they have a slight disparity of interests at stake, that there is a privilege, there is an honor of being a part of the UN, even as a representative of your state, that does not necessarily go along with what you are representing for your state. That there's a way, like I said, there has to be, I have to believe, a way to wedge in some of this honor, the privilege, the high purpose, the high mission of serving humanity through the UN that needs to be on a very personal way, on very personal terms, be shared with the people who are members. They are people. They're people, even behind the suits and ties. So there has to be a way to access that. I wonder if, and I do not know how Winston feels about that. And Winston, please tell me how you would like to proceed. I know Gary's overwhelmed, but I think it would be a good time to either share a part of our article, or share our article, or do something about share with Gary at this point. We've been trying to incorporate our two articles into one. I don't know what it is that we could share with Gary, but I think it would be very fruitful. Even if the entire position is not presented, I think it would really provoke a lot of wonderful stuff and clarify some other things that we talked about. Even if it was not me, I mean, if it's for Gary, whatever Gary's representing, I think it would be very fruitful and productive, dialogically productive, to share this with Gary to review.
Once you make the individual the central focus of aesthetic rights, then it's quite easy conceptually to fit the individual and the role and protection of the individual in the global rule of law framework. It just fits like a glove, And then you can make the case that this additionally enhances the social and human capital of the individual, hence the importance of the rule of law, hence the importance of the aesthetic, etc., etc. That argument is
I think that works very well. It fits well within the framework.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to have too high expectations in Geneva. First of all, half the speakers are, going to be our UN chosen speakers. So we're coming to learn and hear other viewpoints as much as anything else. But we'll have more time, certainly in Alexandria, to brainstorm the way we are now. We won't have this kind of, time in Geneva, but we will have in Alexandria. Can you give us, whatever you're going to speak in Geneva, I'd like to hear the strong, at least now, what would be your strongest statement of formulation of this argument that we've been discussing for 2 hours? What you decide to present in Geneva, I leave to you. But I'd like to hear, if we're going to take the strongest statement of how important this is, and not worried about so much about past precedent as about future necessity and justification, right. How would you put it?
Well, I'm not so sure. I think that before I jump into, I think I'm going to start out by saying many eminent statesmen have recognized that the UN Charter is presently our current global constitution. Okay? And therefore, at the back of this, we have the rule of law concept. But we all recognize that as a constitution, there are limits to the UN Charter, and correspondingly, there are limits to the reach of the global rule of law. Okay? Both of these issues need to be clarified, and with the expectation and the hope that they can be strengthened and improve the framework of participatory governance in the world community. And then I'll go with one of the central problems of the Charter is that it's still very sovereignty dominated. Okay, and that means
national sovereignty dominated.
Sovereignty dominated, and that means that we have a problem with the allocation of so much competence to individual sovereigns when the specific problems that we've all been discussing here today clearly transcend the nation state. And there are several others, okay? So that this particular construction of the Charter is not going to hold for the future. Okay? And then the question is going to be, well, what else is there? And then we need to talk about maybe the development of the authority base of the UN, going back to its we the people thing, looking at global civil society and using illustrations and then say, at the back of this, what we think is important for the UN is ultimately that the UN is the guarantor of the individual in the global system. Okay?
Great.
And if that's the case, all these other issues we talked about come in, if we have a place for the individual in this global constitutional system and rule of law, then there's a real possibility of globally enriching human capital, exponentially expanding creativity, innovation, making a proper place and a real place for aesthetics as a human right, and so on. And then, so the future of the UN's own authority has got to be in the form of the exercise of authority that liberates people, liberates human capacities, values individualism, and liberates expression, and really reaches out to every important component of civil society, the intellectual, the scientific, the economic, whatever, gender, etc., to fortify the global reach of its authority.
We have to find a way to more actively engage civil society as a more direct link to the individual.
I'll put some stuff in there on that.
This is very relevant.
The UN has to find ways to open up
because civil society is that intermediate representative, which can, and with the UN's help, it can become more representative and more effective. We don't have to accept anything as it is.
A constituency for the UN.
And so I've been preparing a speech on, what can we do? What would cultural diplomacy be in the Middle East? And it ties in with what we've just been talking about, because it's quite clear that the diplomacy of sovereign states has not nearly gone far enough to address the issues in the Middle East. In fact, you might even say that sovereign states, even in the Middle East, don't have the capacity to solve this problem. This is a problem that can only be solved when the people in the Middle East accept certain values and attitudes towards each other. Because the sovereign states, even in the democratic ones, like in Israel, are going to get elected. And they're going to get elected only if they're going to, act and implement policies that are acceptable to the people. Well, as a preparation for this, I've been reading a book on the history of the Arabs and the Jews, going back, to the origins of Islam. And it's a subject I knew almost nothing about. And what's really striking is that during the early period of Islam and the Middle Ages, when it was a dominant force, the people of the Middle East, Christian, Jews, Arabs, shared with each other, learned from each other, borrowed extensively from each other in every area culturally, linguistically, the literature, the Hebrew literature of that time was really inspired by Arab, the development of Arabic language. Science came to the Jews through the Arabic influence, bringing it from Greece, Greek science and Greek thought. There was a time, if you go back, when these cultures were really pretty close to one another, where they shared a lot. And it's really it's the nationalism of today that is dividing and polarizing them into opposition. I mean, Arabic itself came out of Aramaic, which was the old Jewish Israeli language, and Islam came out of Judaism in the Old Testament, and it worked in both directions. It worked in all directions. So I think we could even make a case that the solution to problems in the future is going to depend much more on our capacity to win the support of populations. And governments are not very good at that. Today, governments are and civil society has a much greater potential for reaching in and influencing and winning the cooperation of the society than government does. It's interesting to re-look at this role. I've not thought of it before until this discussion, but we may look at government as the source of all the power, but the governments know very well that they're being harassed every day by civil society, by the people. Everything they do is objectionable. Every day they've got to go back for a new election. So I think civil society can also be represented as an important ingredient for the education of the public to support more progressive policies of national government. It's another way of looking at it.
Gary, I have some experience with this. I served on the board of the Sister City program in Gainesville and Lower Zeke during the height of the Cold War, so we exchanged all the time. And currently I'm on the same board, and we have a sister city with an Israeli city and a Palestinian city. And, we just heard from the Secretary of State that he wants us to expand our civil society connections with them, have much more intense relationships with them, because they see movement taking place at the people level and not so much at the government level. So it affirms exactly what you're saying. That's Kerry's view, as we understand it.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Mila, you have your hand up? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Well, going right along with what you were saying, and just sort of maybe strengthen the argument and add some good expressions to it. We now know that actually aesthetics cannot be divorced from politics. In fact, the better politicians, the stronger and more powerful politicians understood the power of aesthetics in production of threats, in production of enemy, and that's the part that Winston talked about, in particular to the production of the Jewish threat and the misrepresentation of the Jews as in the production of the public German enemy. So this is the time when we have to reclaim aesthetics from its propagandistic servitude. If it is not properly democratic and open and accessible and presented as the right, then it's usurped and co-opted for these terrible purposes. So aesthetics, we need to first and foremost see it as its basis that it is, its representation, which automatically involves both cultural and artistic as well as political. How we represent is a certain image that we create of the needs of the population, of the agenda, of the program, of the politician, of the party, on and on and on. So they're enmeshed and cannot be divorced. It is actually for us to wedge in again that notion of representation that it's going to not serve production of threat or enemy, but rather to reclaim its historical representational potential as well as political representational potential. This is what this is boiling down to. So, in other words, unhinging that enmeshment in the wrong that was created for the wrong purpose, and reestablishing them in the more democratic, both of them, both political and aesthetic representation, reestablishing them on healthier and more democratic grounds. That's, I mean, the production of Jewish threat, the production of Arabic threat, and then amongst themselves and things like that. I mean, if they had an opportunity to present themselves to each other, I'm going to tell you, I mean, this is a very personal, this should be off the record. This is a very personal experience, but very well prefaced, right? As a dancer, I'm on top of other things that I do in life, I'm a professional flamenco dancer and Middle Eastern dancer. And Winston probably had an opportunity to see some photos on Facebook. And I will tell you something. I have performed for Jews, Greeks, Turks, and Arabs of all kinds. Mind you, there are Arabs who are Mennonite Christian, who are Shiite, Sunni, or on and on and on, all in one place. When they were told, and I was told, because I was at one point, to be honest with you, trying to make sure that I do justice to each culture, knowing their background between Turks and Greeks or Jews, and I was told that for now, everything is suspended because you, with your dancing, are speaking the common language of all of us. That's what I was told by all of them. A very personal experience. And this notion of suspension, I think it's the ultimate sovereignty. We've learned it the wrong way, I will point out. But the ultimate sovereignty is the power of sovereignty to suspend its own power. That's the ultimate power. And we know that it has been abused by, say, by U.S., who abides by this and that, and in one moment over the 9/11 security suspends all of its own rules because it can do so. But the ultimate sovereignty that I mean, I'm terrified a little bit to invoke the notion of transcendence here, is the one that is capable of suspending. And we have to play that card a little bit, a grand card of greater people. We have to play the grand card of telling them that the ultimate, the control of masculinity, patriarchal masculinity is actually of controlling not others, but controlling oneself. The control of the ultimate powers is to show the grandeur of the magnitude of merciful action is exactly in suspending its capacity to decapitate or punish and things like that, which, yet again, U.S. has a lot to do work on when it comes to capital punishment or anything like that. There are multiple ways. I mean, we're brainstorming in the meeting of the minds today, but there are multiple little angles within which these people need to be learned. If you want to have a humanitarian appeal, then it has to be reaching them at the level of their own humanity. It has to hit a nerve in the gut somehow.
Okay, thank you. A very rich discussion.